Elis, instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "not an isolated sacrifice". He said little at first. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. He listened to mechanics and pilots, to the soft abuse that language takes when men try to make sense of loss. He sat with charts, with comparative data on climb rates and turn radii, and his mind, trained in method and flight, sought a way to transpose geometry into survival. The match trick was an answer born of that labor. Two aircraft flying slightly offset figure eights so that when a zero followed one, it would present its tail to the other. It was simple enough to be drawn with matches and stubborn enough to survive the chaos of battle. The first practical test of the idea was not at a grand carrier deck or in the heart of a great fleet action. It was a modest trial on February 10, 1942, where conditions were little more forgiving than the idea itself. Thach's early experiments, brief demonstrations, careful two-plane drills, were meant to answer one question: could trained pilots keep the geometry when breathing became heavy, when adrenaline squeezed the throat, when smoke and splinters spat through the canopy? The answer would determine whether the match trick was a classroom parlor trick or a doctrine. He sent pilots up in pairs. Engines screamed, clipped sunlight off instrument glass, radio static filled with clipped calls. Bogey bearing 180 came a voice. 2 zeros at deck, visual. The men went to the pattern they had practiced. One wildcat would present, then peel away slightly. Its wingman would cross low, closing on the angle where the zero's nose would inevitably fix if it continued to chase. The motions looked awkward from behind, almost casual. From within the cockpit, they were everything but. The first day was messy, the second cleaner. Pilots missed beats. One or two nearly broke the arc and forced the single turning fight. Thach kept his jaw tight. After landing, the debrief was short, clinical. A few lost positions, but the geometry holds, one pilot said. Gave the zero something he didn't expect. The matchbox on the bench gleamed in the hangar light, an object that had done no harm and perhaps would do great good. The field is not kind to invención. Institutional friction came quickly and politely. A new tactic, even one born of the cockpit, had to prove itself against doctrine, against the natural suspicion of those who command fleets. Admirals and staff officers answered with the cool, necessary language of risk. Tests, reports, observer notes. Thach, methodical, filed his reports and kept teaching. He did not seek headlines, he sought results. Results came under a different sky. June 4, 1942, Midway. The battle that would become a pivot of the Pacific War began with aircraft like spirits thrown across a vast ocean. Wildcats launched from decks that vibrated with the weight of men and metal. Pilots strapped in, feeling the cold metal of the seat and the distant ache of fear. Thach was not merely an instructor now. His ideas would be tested where stakes were decisive. Wildcats and Zeros tangled in numbers that changed by the minute. Radio calls lit the air. Bogey, visual, 20 enemy fighters at 10,000. Men readied themselves to be outmaneuvered, outgunned, outspirited. The weave, a word that would come to be used casually by pilots and staff alike, was folded into the choreography of combat that day. When two Wildcats held the mutual crossing, a Zero that fixed on one found its flank exposed to the other. The geometry forced a pursuer into a momentary vulnerability. In the frantic, noisy crucible of Midway, small moments decided much. A Zero that had committed to a tail pursuit would, for a fraction of a second, present itself to the second Wildcat. The second, trained to anticipate, would not overcommit but would meet the enemy's tail with suppressive fire or a climb that placed the Zero between two lines of fire. The result was not instantaneous victory. Combat is complicated that way, messy, noisy, and shaped by luck as often as skill. But by the time reports were consolidated, the improvement was no longer anecdotal. Squadrons employing the weave began to report fewer losses and more survivals. Pilots cited the tactic when describing how a wingman's cross had taken a Zero's attention at the critical moment. A shift had begun. The action of June 23, 1942 at Santa Cruz and the fighting around Guadalcanal on July 7, 1942 produced further field tests. Each engagement offered its own harsh laboratory. Different seas, different carrier decks, different pilot rosters. At Santa Cruz, the weave showed its value in chaotic multi-plane fights, where discipline and mutual trust turned two vulnerable fighters into a defensive geometry. On July 7, 1942, over Guadalcanal, the tactic helped pilots survive against an enemy that had honed counter-tactics, testing the weave's limits. The Japanese pilots, too, adapted. In some cases, they learned to feint and to feint again, to force misreads. But adaptation is a dialectic. For each counter, a new measure of discipline and coordination preserved the weave's utility. Behind the clashes, administrative channels hummed with memos and recommendations. Thach's notes, the matchbox diagrams he used at briefings, and the after-action reports from pilots accumulated into a case the Navy could not ignore. By mid to late 1942, those field reports and training results pushed the matter toward wider adoption. Fleet orders began to replicate what men at the front had taught. The matchbox diagrams found their way onto blackboards in training rooms as instructors condensed combat into lines and angles fit for a chalkboard. The victories did not come without cost. For every dogfight in which the weave saved a life, there were others that produced funeral notices and empty places in mess halls. Thach read letters from grieving families with the same grave attention he gave to aerodynamics. Memory softens the arithmetic of such scenes. What remains sharp is sensation, the metallic taste in the mouth, the vibration of the controls in the palm, the sight of wingmen slashing like fish through blue. Thach did not perform heroics for the sake of recognition. He maneuvered, he called, and he fought with the same geometry he had taught others. He made choices that risked his own safety to allow others a path to survival. The reports that followed would list him among those whose coolness under fire deserved formal recognition. Recognition came eventually. In February 1943, John Thach was awarded the Navy Cross. The citation recorded acts of leadership and tactical innovation performed under fire. For Thach, the decoration was not the point. It was, he thought, confirmation that a simple idea, tested in the harsh arithmetic of war, had averted more deaths than it had caused. He accepted the medal with a modest demeanor, more attentive to the pilots whose lives it had saved than to any brass on his chest. As doctrine shifted, the weave's influence spread beyond the immediate squadrons that first adopted it. Training commands folded the geometry into curricula. Instructors traced matches on blackboards to teach new pilots the art of reciprocal defense. The tactic found cousins in other services. The logic of mutual support crossed domain boundaries, informing aerial doctrine in ways that outlived the men who first taught it. Institutional adoption was never instantaneous, but mid to late 1942 saw a turn. What had been an experimental measure became part of the lexicon of naval fighter tactics. That spread did not erase complexity. Enemy pilots adapted, employing feints and team tactics designed to break coordinated pairs. Where the weave shone, it required steadiness and a willingness to execute the less glamorous work of mutual protection. Thach's writings and briefings emphasized those points: simplicity in concept, rigor in practice. He pushed for training that would instill reflexes as much as understanding, so that pilots would not have to think through each crossing in battle. The motion needed to become habit. The human dimension persisted at every turn. There were funerals that left mess halls hollow, letters from widows that required a desk officer's careful reply, moments in which the cost of survival and the calculus of duty collided. Thach kept a list, names of pilots who had flown his drills and not returned, tucked away in a notebook. He read those names like a prayer. When he taught new pilots, he sometimes paused to mention them, not to dramatize, but to remind. Innovation saves, but it is never a salve for loss. By the time the Navy issued broader fleet instructions endorsing coordinated tactics, the evidence had become unambiguous enough to close argument. Reports from Midway, from Santa Cruz, from Guadalcanal had accumulated into operational proof. Kill and loss tallies, anecdotal debriefs, and the testimony of returned pilots converged to show that the weave reduced attrition and increased survivability. Commanders who once looked askance now ordered drills and included the geometry in carrier briefings. The strategy moved from the benches of casual demonstration to training syllabuses and fleet orders, an arc of adoption that threaded field-tested experience into institutional practice. Thach's later career carried the quiet marks of a man who had done his duty and then done it again in instruction. He continued to teach, to refine tactics, and to counsel younger officers. He did not become ostentatious about his role. When asked, he'd attribute much of the success to the discipline of his wingmen and to the stubborn insistence of pilots who trained until the motion of a weave became as natural as straight and level flight. For him, the most important validation came not from medals, but from letters, reunions, and the knowledge that men who had flown under his guidance returned to tell their children about a trick with matches that had kept them alive. Years later, in a quiet museum case, a small matchbox rested on a bed of fabric under glass. Visitors peered and read the placard. A simple object that had been a diagram, a classroom prop, a talisman. People found a strange comfort in the notion that something so ordinary could sit at the origin of an idea that saved lives. Veterans came and pressed a hand against the case's cool glass as if feeling through a membrane of time. Children who would never know the smell of avgas or the metallic scream of a fighter engine saw instead a tiny box and a story about ingenuity and care. Legacy measures itself in many ways. There were statistics compiled in staff rooms and reflected in after-action reports, improvements in survivability, and more cautious engagement tactics where mutual support was the rule. There were the men who carried a memory of a wingman's cross for the rest of their days. There was, too, an institutional lesson that sound, tested innovations from those at the point of contact merit attention, and, when they prove themselves, prompt change. Thach, who had been modest about recognition, accepted the Navy Cross in February 1943 with the same steady calm he had applied to teaching. Later, as an instructor and a leader, he watched doctrine shift and felt, in small, private ways, vindicated. His matchbox was never a symbol of glory. It was an emblem of a particular kind of problem-solving, one that sought to reduce suffering by altering the geometry of danger itself. The weave did not make war humane. It made it survivable in some measure. It saved lives, and in saving them, it left scars and memories that men carried home. Years after the last carrier steamed into port for the final time, veterans would gather and trace patterns with their fingers on tabletops, reconstructing in jest and reverence the motions that had kept them alive. They would point, often with a laugh, tempered by something like sorrow, to the matchbox and say, "That little trick kept us breathing a while longer." Story and theory, when joined by practice, can become legacy. The matchbox sat in that museum as both artifact and metaphoric hinge. Small, ordinary, a thing that rearranged the odds when paired with discipline and trust. Visitors read the plaque and imagined the pilots who had learned to trust a crossing instead of a chase. They imagined the men who, in cramped cockpits and over oceans vast and indifferent, had taught one another to trade places and, by doing so, to come home. Beyond medals and memos, the weave's true residue was in the faces of returned pilots and in the children who grew up hearing a story that began with a matchbox on a bench. They were the living testimony that ingenuity in the hands of responsible leaders can lessen the toll of conflict, that courage is sometimes a matter of steadiness rather than bravado, and that an idea as simple as crossing paths at the right angle can make the difference between life and a telegram home. The matchbox, once in a cockpit, then in a classroom, now lay in glass. Sunlight caught the tiny paper label and made it almost bright. Visitors read the dates and the terse language. They looked at photographs of men in leather helmets and goggles, faces smeared from oil and laughter, and tried to feel what it was to fly in a world where small things saved lives. Above the case, a line in the placard noted the broader arc. Tests at Wake Island on February 10, 1942. Combat trials at Midway on June 4, 1942. Further engagements through June 23, 1942 and July 7, 1942. Adoption across the fleet through mid and late 1942. A formal recognition in February 1943 with the awarding of the Navy Cross. The dates were anchors. The lives behind them were the reason. Pilots and commanders moved on. Doctrine continued to evolve. The match trick became, for many, a footnote in larger textbooks of aerial warfare, a small genius in a long catalog of human responses to danger. But for those who had flown under its protection, the memory of a wingman's trust, the cross that came at the instant needed, never faded. They told the story in reunions, in letters to families, in quiet moments when they thought of those who did not return.
Thach himself retired from active innovation and continued in service long enough to see the tactics he had fostered become part of a living tradition. He remained, in the recollections of those who flew with him, a steady figure who taught through demonstration, who measured a man by his willingness to fly a pattern and trust his comrade to hold the line.
His legacy was not merely uma medalla or a matchbox behind glass. It was the fact that men learned to live a little longer because they flew the geometry he drew. There are images that stay. A pair of wildcats crossing beneath a sun that burned without pity. A matchbox thumbed by a steady hand. A blackboard covered in chalk lines, and the quiet of a museum room where visitors speak in muted tones. Those images are not triumphal. They are practical, almost austere. They record a kind of cautious progress, the careful wiring of procedure and habit that allows men to return from peril. The story of the weave and its inventor is, in the end, a story about responsibility. It is the answer a teacher gives when asked what to do when tools are imperfect and enemies are skilled. Do not rely on individual heroics alone. Forge a method, teach it until it becomes reflex, and accept that doing so may save a man who will go home to tell the tale. That ethic, discipline, care, and the humility to test an idea again and again shaped a small but consequential change in aerial warfare. Months after the fleet orders moved the weave from experiment to doctrine, Thach sat once at an airfield watching new pilots practice the crossing until it was no longer a concept but an instinct. He saw pairs of young faces, mouths set, hands working the stick, and he breathed easier. The matchbox had fulfilled its modest destiny. If you were moved by this story of quiet ingenuity and sacrifice, please like, subscribe, and share. Tell us where you're watching from, or whether your family has a service story to remember. Your comments help keep these memories alive. The matchbox's smallness belied the scale of consequence it represented. In the glass case, it seemed almost apologetic, a trivial thing kept from being lost by the careful geometry of display. Yet the object carried a freight that did not show in a photograph or on a placard. The memory of hands steadying a throttle, the quiet spoken between two men who had learned to time fear into a maneuver. Those histories do not always make bold headlines. They arrive later, in the way a son learns a father's habit of folding a letter, or a daughter picks up a phrase, fly the pattern, and says it without thinking, until one day it steadies a life. After the formal honors and the medals and the doctrine memos, the weave entered a different class of life, private, habitual, taken for granted. In training halls, instructors who had not been at wake or midway nevertheless taught crossing the way their mentors had taught other things, step by step, until it lost its novelty and became part of the muscle map. At squadron dinners, the subject sometimes surfaced as a chew of memory, the kind that began with a laugh and ended in silence when someone recalled the men who never came back. Those silences held as much of the story as the ceremonies did. One afternoon, in the years when the hairlines on the veterans' heads had silvered to the color of the Pacific at dawn, a reunion convened at an inland airfield. The hangar smelled of oil and old wood and the varnish on instrument panels. Men who had flown in different campaigns found one another by habits, the way they inclined their heads,
the shorthand of a wink that meant, "I saw you," the way their hands remembered controls. Thach sat among them not as a distant founder, but as an elder who still moved through the room with the plainness of a man who had taught by example. Young officers came to him asking about the old days, and he answered with less legend than instruction. Keep your pattern, watch your wingman, practice until it's not choice but reflex. A widow whose husband had flown wildcats and kept a shoebox of letters under his bed came to the reunion as well. She passed by the cases and photographs and lingered where a photograph showed a pair of planes silhouetted against a white sun. Her fingers found a bench rail and she closed her eyes. In a patchwork of memory, she felt again the quick goodbye in a doorway, the soldier's way of shortening words so that a kiss could fit in the space left. The matchbox meant to her the morning that did not come. It meant the geometry of grief, how one small object could anchor an entire sequence of days. Historians later argued over the weave's origins in the kind of careful, pedantic way historians do. Some emphasized Thach's role in defining and codifying the pattern. Others traced antecedents in air forces that had experimented with mutual support. The debate was not merely academic. It shaped curricula in war colleges and influenced how navies and air arms balanced technology and training. Where technology promised advantage, doctrine insisted on redundancy. Where machines could fail, habit and mutual discipline might yet carry the day. The argument, in the end, became part of the weave's story. No single inventor, but a network of practice and correction, of trial, and of those willing to be wrong until they were right. Across decades, the crossing found companions in other innovations born of necessity. Pilots who had once used a match trick to trade a position now taught anti-submarine crews how to coordinate sweeps, convoy commanders how to hold a line under air and ground, officers how to retreat methodically so that fewer lives were lost. The principle, arrange motion so that the enemy's strengths are met by a steady method rather than by chance, migrated into manuals and into the quiet calculus of commanders who preferred to work the geometry of an encounter rather than to gamble on a single stroke of daring. There were, of course, failures. Not every execution matched the diagram on the blackboard. There were missions where a misread signal, a gust, or the simple fact of human fatigue meant that the weave could not be completed in time. Those losses were studied with a chisel.
The pattern that had been life-saving in one sky could be unwieldy or outright dangerous when misapplied in another. Training, those who had watched the transfer across generations realized, required the hard work of translation. Hold what mattered, shed what had been fashion. That was why instructors spent so much time teaching judgment along with the geometry. The crossing was a shape, but the temper was the teacher. Thach's handwriting survived on a series of yellowing pages filed among more formal manuals. The pages contained not only stepwise procedure, but aphorisms, short, stubborn lines that read like commands and like comforts. A young flight surgeon found one in a crate and taped it to the wall above her desk. Teach the heart to be steady, the hands will follow. She read it between patient charts, and on nights when a pilot came into sick call with a tremor in his hands, she would speak of practice as if it were a salve. She did not pretend that practice was a cure for every wound. She only insisted that repetition had a moral effect, hardening the will against sudden collapse. In a lecture hall at a technical university, the crossing appeared on a slide in a talk about systems design. The presenter, typically careful, used the crossing as an extended metaphor, not to romanticize combat, but to explain how redundancy and mutual observation kept complex systems alive. Students scribbled notes in a shorthand that would not appear in flight logs, but that might, years later, appear in a safety checklist for a remote power grid or in the coordination plan for a maritime rescue. The image of two units holding at each other's six migrated, unpredictable and persistent, into places far from hangars. Back at the museum, a small group of former aviators gathered for a commemoration. They were older now, and the crowd that had once been theirs had thinned in ways that had not been visible when the world was younger. They did not read speeches. They sat in a circle and told variations of the same memories, of nights spent learning under running lights, of the weight of a charted crossing when the stakes were high, of the first time a trainee's hands did not tremble in the moment that required steadiness. One man produced, with a smile that was tempered by loss, the wine-dark photograph that had traveled in a trunk for decades. Faces that had been blackened with oil in youth were now pale in the image of retirement. They laughed then, briefly and with hesitation, at the audacity of their younger selves. The laughter was a claim against time. Outside the museum, a journalist waiting for a taxi watched one of the veterans walk away and then saw a young pilot cross the square with the same measured step. The journalist thought about lines and inheritances and about how story gets lodged in things, matchboxes, photographs, the call and response of phraseology. And she filed a piece that night arguing that technique was a moral inheritance more than it was a technical one. Readers would debate the piece. Some would call it sentimental, others would be moved. The argument mattered less to the pattern than the fact that someone had, once again, taken the trouble to name it. On a late spring morning, Fat's widow sorted a drawer of letters and came upon a folded note he had once tucked away from the day he argued in favor of keeping a certain exercise in training syllabi. She did not read it aloud. She let the paper sit between thumb and forefinger, and she marveled at the way a small insistence could outlast flesh. Around her, life went its orderly, imperfect way. Plants needed water. A neighbor asked for help with a fence. A grandson asked if he might visit the museum to see an artifact he had only heard about. She agreed, and when they walked the route to the displays, she told him briefly about the crossing, about the matchbox, about a teacher who taught steadiness as a discipline of the heart. The boy listened as if she were telling him how to tie his shoes. He left with a question rehearsed for the docent and a seriousness in his stride that was slightly disproportionate to his age. The matchbox, under its glass, did what objects often do. It reduced the epic to the intimate. Visitors approached it expecting war, and found instead an instruction in the smallness of the gestures that preserved life. They looked and left with an image of two lines crossing, and the faint sense that they too could arrange themselves for another safety. The lesson slid into lunches, and into the order of days, and, when needed, into that tense liminal hour between possibility and catastrophe. That evening, as the sun folded into the horizon, a trainee sitting in a dim operation room thumbed the edge of a manual. Outside, engines warmed in lines, and somewhere beyond the reach of the town, a sea ferry adjusted course because of winds no chart had predicted. In both places, people repeated actions taught to them by others, and adjusted them to new contours. The marriage of old temper and fresh circumstance continued, stubborn and humane. On a small table in the hangar, a new set of model airplanes leaned against a map.
A recruit traced a finger along a drawn crossing and then, quietly and without ceremony, marked a small revision. A note about timing in gust fronts, a reminder to watch a co-pilot's hands. It was nearly invisible, a marginalia that would matter only if someone else read it and accepted it, and then passed it on. That was how the weave endured, through the benign tyranny of attention and the patience to teach, and through the willingness of those who came after to keep learning. The geometry remained, the temper refined it.